Hi, welcome to this webinar. We will be starting in one more minute. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are based. We welcome you to this gold standard webinar on the methodology to estimate and verify averted mortality and disability adjusted life years from cleaner household air. My name is Sriskam Subramanian and I am a consultant with the gold standard. My co-presenters today are Richard Iliff, who is Manager Standards at the Gold Standard Foundation, and Charity Garland, who is a Field Sciences Analyst at the Berkeley Air Monitoring Group. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get into the slides. The duration of this webinar is 1 hour, and we will have a brief Q&A session at the end of the presentation. In case we are not able to take your questions, please do send them using the chat option on your panel or email us at info@goldstandard.org and we'll be sure to get back to you. We'd like to start off this presentation by explaining a little bit the objective behind developing this methodology. So around 3 billion people cook and heat their houses across the world using solid fuels like wood and charcoal, and they use these fuels on open fires or traditional stoves. Household air pollution or indoor air pollution is the single largest environmental health risk, and the World Health Organization estimates that this causes 4.3 million premature deaths each year. Majority of these deaths are actually preventable, and they occur in low and middle income countries. You can see some numbers here in terms of the percentage of deaths attributable to different diseases. Now, the objective behind developing this methodology is that that under result-based financing, there is a tremendous potential to incentivize implementation of projects that reduce household air pollution. However, what was previously missing in the market was a robust monitoring and evaluation framework that will demonstrate that health benefits have actually been achieved. And this is the exact issue that this methodology attempts to resolve. This methodology provides a robust framework to demonstrate health benefits from cleaner cooking, heating, and lighting technologies. We would like to firstly acknowledge the role of our funders, who helped us develop this methodology, and they are Goldman Sachs, the World Bank Group, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade or Australian Aid, and World Vision Australia. We would also like to further, acknowledge the role played by Sequoia Capital, who was a key partner, helped us arrange, the funding for developing this methodology. And we'd also like to acknowledge the role played by the expert working group, which was convened by the World Bank to develop this methodology. Professor Kirk Smith and his team at UC Berkeley also played a very critical role by developing the HAPIT or the Household Air Pollution Intervention Tool, about which you will be hearing in the subsequent slides. and also the role played by the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstove. A lot of the material which has been developed as part of this project involved the contribution of the Berkeley Air Monitoring Group and Ajay Pilarisetti from UC Berkeley. So the expert working group, which provided inputs during the development of this methodology, included organizations like Climate Care, SNB, World Vision Australia, so on and so forth. So you can see a list of organizations and experts who contributed to the development of this methodology on your screen. Subsequent, to the development of this methodology, we realize that the methodology is actually very complex and can be expensive to implement due to high monitoring costs. Therefore, it was felt that it is essential to enable infrastructure and build capacities for governments, potential project developers and practitioners, auditors, and exposure monitoring and testing agencies to understand the benefits of using this methodology and support its application. And this would ultimately contribute to driving much needed finance for the clean cooking sector. So so with this idea, the Gold Standard Foundation was contracted by the World Bank Group to develop enabling infrastructure and build capacities on the Gold Standard ADALYs methodology. The specific tasks which were included under this this assignment were firstly to develop a Cookstove IQ tool, which is basically a web-based tool that allows project developers to design, develop, and monitor carbon finance-based Cookstove projects. So this is a tool on which Gold Standard has been working over the last few months, and as part of this project, we also look to integrate the ADALYs methodology in this IQ tool. Another aspect of this project was the updation of the HAPED, which is a very essential cog in the wheel of this methodology, and it helps convert the monitored particulate matter 2.5 exposures to ADALYs based on the current health literature which is publicly available. And this project also involved the development of guidance material for potential projects in the form of technical reference manual, online tutorials, and also these series of 2 webinars which are being hosted by the Gold Standard today and tomorrow. And lastly, the Gold Standard also organized 4 regional capacity building workshops across Asia, Africa, and Latin America to further enhance the understanding of this methodology for different stakeholders. Now, these regional training workshops, as you can see on the screen, were held in Chennai in India in May, in Lima in June, in Ghana, in Accra in July, and in Bangkok in the last week of July. And these training workshops were very well attended, and the attendees included a wide range of stakeholders, ranging from project developers to government agencies, auditors to monitoring and testing experts and academicians. So the course of the next few slides, I would like to briefly take everyone through an overview of the methodology and give a sort of a broad overview of what this methodology actually entails. So the methodology uses exposure to fine particulate matter or PM 2.5 as the best indicator of household air pollution. This is done because PM 2.5 is considered to be the dominant contributor to burden of different diseases like stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, etc. As a result of air pollution, regardless of the source or the fuel which is being used. And PM 2.5 exposure causes negative health impacts, leading to several diseases. It's also important to know that this methodology focuses on personal exposure measurements only for primary cooks. It also does attribute exposures to non-primary cooks, and we'll be explaining that in subsequent slides. In terms of the broad eligibility requirements, projects that lead to a verifiable reduction in PM 2.5 exposure levels as a result of change in household energy use or for cooking, heating, and lighting are eligible. Um, the project should introduce cleaner cooking devices, fuels, or practices. And on your screen you can see examples of cooking devices, clean fuels, and practices. It should also be noted that technologies such as solar lighting that lead to additional reduction in PM 2.4 exposure are also eligible under this methodology. Safe water supply and treatment technologies are only eligible if in the baseline scenario, solid fuels are being burned to treat drinking water. For example, in the baseline, woody biomass is being used to boil water, and the eligibility list or the list of interventions or projects which are included in the methodology are by no means exhaustive. So in case there are some ideas or project types which you feel could be a good fit with this methodology and are not included in the methodology as of now, please feel free to check with the Gold Standard Secretariat. In terms of the negative list, fossil fuels are not eligible, in the sense that any project that involves a fuel switch to coal, charcoal, or kerosene is not allowed. Also, projects leading to a greater efficiency in the project scenario as a result of use of coal or kerosene is again not eligible. There is two exceptions to this rule. One is that in case the efficient use of charcoal is achieved when compared to the baseline, then these types of projects are eligible, as well as use of modern fuels. For example, liquefied petroleum gas and electricity derived from fossil fuels are also eligible, since they can substantially reduce exposures to PM 2.5. So these two exceptions are there. There are a couple of more specific eligibility criteria which projects are required to meet. For example, for clean cook stoves and heating stoves, the project technology or the project cook stove should have a manufacturer specified thermal efficiency of at least 20%. The project should also design and include an incentive mechanism which discourages the parallel use of baseline technology. And the project should also provide evaluation criteria to avoid double counting of the same project technology in other activities. In terms of the methodological approach which is laid out in this ADALYs methodology, the methodology essentially quantifies health benefits from reductions in PM 2.4 exposures, and this quantification is done by using published exposure response relations that link PM 2.5 levels to these 5 major diseases. And the metric which is used to quantify the health benefit is Averted DALYs or ADALYs or DALYs Averted. So different synonyms are used for this. And the advantage of using this metric is that it actually includes both years of life lost due to early death and also years of healthy life lost due to onset of disease. So it actually involves or includes both mortality and morbidity. The methodology has a 2-step process to quantify health benefits. The first step involves field monitoring of PM 2.5 exposures, and once the exposure values are obtained, these are inputted into the HAPIT, which uses an epidemiologically derived exposure response function to convert these exposures into ADALYs. There are some other requirements which are also laid down in this methodology. The first one is the monitoring of carbon monoxide for charcoal-based interventions. So if your project is a charcoal-based intervention, then it is important to carry out mandatory room area monitoring of carbon monoxide in all households which are undergoing, the personal exposure measurement. As a minimum, a 24 hours monitoring in a sample of the households undergoing, PM 2.5 exposure measurement needs to be carried out for charcoal measure for carbon monoxide measurement. And if the 24-hour average CO concentration exceeds 7 milligram per meter cube, which is a threshold provided by the World Health Organization. So if this average exceeds 7 ng per meter cube in a fraction of the monitored households, then the same fraction will not be eligible for claiming ADALYs. There is also a requirement around reassessment of baseline personal exposures. So if there are projects with a lifetime of more than 5 years, then a new round of baseline surveys and baseline personal exposure monitoring shall be conducted, after the 5th year, and it shall be done thereafter, after every 5 years. Now, in terms of the monitoring requirements laid down under this methodology, so these are the primary monitoring parameters which are included. The first one, like I mentioned, is the personal exposure to particulate matter 2.5 before and after the intervention, and this will be these values will be obtained from the baseline and project personal exposure measurement. Project developers are also required to carry out a baseline household survey, which will reveal information on the typical size of household, the number of adults in the household, and children of number of children of age less than 5 years. It will also provide information on the baseline technology type and the fuels being used, and other details of the primary cook. The project household survey would again reveal information on the household survey, the number of people above 5 years and below 5 years. It will also give information and the types and extent of the fuels which are being used. It will also give information on the usage of the project technology and whether the project stove is in use or not. The project survey would also provide information whether there are any changes which have been identified within the project boundary. For example, has the project population moved on to to an even more cleaner fuel and technology? And it will also give information on the percentage of population using the polluting fuel. Then there is the project database which has to be provided, would give information on the number of targeted households under the project, and there is also the aspect of the CO monitoring which I had mentioned earlier. The first survey which is required to be conducted as per this methodology is a baseline survey, which will provide information on the cooking practices in the baseline scenario. So by doing this survey, project developers will collect information about the characteristics of the target population, the amount of baseline fuel which is consumed, what are the typical technologies in use, in the baseline population, and also how the technology and fuel is used seasonally. So are there any variations in their usage based on seasons? And based on this information, the target population should be then grouped into representative baseline scenarios, which will be based on typical fuel and technology use patterns. So for example, after conducting the baseline survey, one could arrive at potentially two baseline scenarios. The first baseline scenario is that one group uses a domestic 3-stone fired stove using wood fuel, whereas the second group uses domestic traditional stoves using charcoal. So this baseline survey is required to be carried out before distribution of the project technology, and also it has to be repeated when the crediting period is renewed. Further information on this is provided in Annex 2 of the methodology. There are some key considerations which have to be kept in mind while carrying out the baseline survey. So before doing the survey, one has to obtain the consent from the participating households, and they should also be guaranteed data privacy. One should also clearly communicate that they have low risk from the equipment that they will be using for personal exposure measurements, and they are not responsible for any loss or damage to the equipment, and they have the option to withdraw from the study at any time without any penalty or repercussions. Personal identifiers such as name, address, so on should not be entered in the database that will be available for analysis. And the household should be identified, primarily using the ID numbers, code linking them to the personal identifiers, and these should be, kept locked away by the field manager. And of course, no photos should be taken in which the individuals can be identified, without taking their prior consent. Coming to the project survey, aims to provide information on year-to-year trends in end-user characteristics, such as the technology used, the type of fuel used, the typical kitchen characteristics, and the seasonal variations. It aims to identify changes in the project boundary, over the crediting period of the project. It is required to be carried out annually, and the first survey should be carried out after 6 months of start of use of the new technology in the households. Further information on the project survey can be found in the household survey guidelines, and the key considerations are the same as was discussed in previous slide for the baseline survey. So these are annual and are to be conducted with the end user representative of each of the project scenario groups. The minimum sample size which is required is that if the total population is less than 300, then a minimum sample size of 30. The group size is between 300 to 1000, then a minimum sample size is 10% of the group size, and for any group size greater than 1000, then a minimum of 100 samples should be chosen. And the methodology provides an annex which has further information on the objectives of the survey and the typical questions that one can use, to carry out these surveys. Another important component of this methodology is the usage survey, and the aim of this survey is to determine the fraction of users who have stopped using the project technology completely. That is to determine the drop-off rate. And the frequency for this is that it has to be carried out annually, or more frequently in case there is a request for issuance. So, for example, if there is a biannual request for issuance, then it has to be carried out every time there is a request for issuance. The methodology allows project developers to use surveys or use continuous store monitors or store usage monitors. In case a survey is conducted, then a minimum total sample size for the survey should be 100, with at least 30 samples for project technologies of each age being included in the final list of samples. And the approach which can be used for sampling could be simple random or could be stratified random sampling, and there are some other approaches which are mentioned in the methodology. In case project developers choose to use continuous store monitors, then a minimum of 100 households for at least 90 days, should be monitored using these CSMs, and at least 30 samples for each project for project technologies of each age which is being credited should be included in this list. There are some other best practice information which is also given in the methodology. However, it should be noted that there are updated usage survey requirements and guidelines which are available on the gold standard website, and the METH applicant should actually refer to these to this updated usage guidelines in order to meet the requirements for identifying the drop off. The slides that are presented on the usage survey are just indicative in that sense. So with this, I now hand over the baton to my colleague Abhishek, who will be taking us through the slides on personal exposure monitoring, as well as the different instruments and devices which are available to monitor personal exposures and usage rate.
Thanks, Shishkan. Hello, everyone. This is Abhishek Goel from Gold Standard. I'm working as Senior Technical Director at the Gold Standard Foundation. Actually, these slides were supposed to be, taken up by by Charity from Berkeley Monitoring Group, but due to some unknown circumstances, she is not able to join us on this webinar. So I'm just stepping in, in her place. So I may not be, as effective as Charity, would have been. So would apologize for that, and would request you to, like, bear with me. So moving on, with these slides on personal exposure monitoring. So this personal exposure is basically, a measurement of the concentration of a particular pollutant, in this case PM 2.5, to which an individual is getting, exposed, and this is the main parameter for monitoring in the methodology. There have been many studies conducted by experts in the field to try and establish correlation between personal exposures and room area concentrations, say for PM 2.5. But no no correlation could be established, with required confidence, and hence this methodology relies on personal exposure monitoring rather than room area concentrations to establish the health impacts from indoor air pollution. Also because the human activity follows a diurnal pattern which can vary between days, we require at least 48 hours of monitoring for personal exposure to fulfill the criteria of the methodology. And in case someone wishes to go for longer than 48 hours, then that should still be done in multiples of 24 hours. All the exposure monitoring as per the methodology should meet 90-30 precision criteria. We have designed an Excel tool where you can input your baseline and project exposure data, and this Excel tool will check for you whether you are meeting 90-30 precision or not. Next slide. So establishing the exposure in the baseline scenario. So of course, this should be done before the project technology is in use in these sample households. So as per the methodology, we say that to meet this 90-30 criteria, you must take up this exposure monitoring in at least 30 households in the baseline scenario. Depending on your project data, you may need to increase the sample size to meet the precision, or you may have to apply the error if the precision is not met, if you want to keep the number of sample of households same. And as I said before, the exposure monitoring should be done at least for 48 continuous hours on 2 consecutive days. It should also be done in a season, which is considered most representative of the full year. Now, this is a very generic statement, that we have in the methodology, because it's very difficult for us to give, requirements which would fulfill, like, the conditions for your project scenario. So it is advisable that, if you have a lot of variation in the seasons in your project area, it would be advisable to, discuss that with gold standard before you choose your season for monitoring the baseline exposure in the sample households. And the sample households, where the main cook smokes, or and if where there's a, say, trash burning outside the households. So such households, should be excluded from the samples. In the project scenario, again, like the minimum sample size is 30 for measuring the exposures, and it's possible that when you choose 30 households for sampling, like some of the households may drop off for some reason. So it is always advisable to have a bigger than 30 sample size, and so that you will at least get 30 households for your actual exposure monitoring. So this applies to both baseline and the project scenario. And of course, the project household should still be using the project technology to measure the project level exposures for the households. again should be done for at least 48 hours, like the baseline scenario. And in case you're using light scattering measurement approach, then that should be adjusted against the the gravimetric equivalents. So the approach to adjust your light scattering measurements to the gravimetric measurements is explained in the methodology. So further, further guidelines on the exposure monitoring. So you should be carrying out your project scenario exposure monitoring at least once in 2 years. So that's the minimum frequency. But you can always go for annual monitoring if you wish to do so. So to actually reduce the cost for monitoring, we had this once in 2 year requirement in the methodology included there. So in case you are not going for every year monitoring and going it every like every other year, then for this year in which the exposures are not monitored, you can estimate the exposure for that year based on the previous year where the exposures were actually monitored. And in that scenario, what we will do is, for this year where you are not monitoring exposure, we would set aside 40% of the issuable ADALYs into a reserve, and would issue you only 60% of the issuable ADALYs. Then when you go to the say the third year where you will again do the exposure monitoring, you would calculate the average of exposure of year 1 and year 3, and recalculate your your ADALYs for year 2 based on this average value. And if there is any sort of shortfall which was issued to you in the year 2, that will be issued back to you in the year 3 for the year 2 exposure reductions. But the usage rate has to be like monitored every year, and the actual value of usage rate should be used in every year ADALYs calculation. So coming to the monitoring equipment. So this is not really my area of expertise at all. But again, in absence of charity, I'll just try and give it a shot. So there are several types of personal exposure monitoring instruments which are available. So as I said before, there are two types of personal exposure monitoring. One is called gravimetric approach, and the other is called the optical approach. The gravimetric approach is more precise approach for measuring the exposures, and that's why the methodology requires you to either rely completely on gravimetric approach, or if you want to use the optical approach, you have to establish the adjustment factor between gravimetric and the light scattering approach, and then only use that light scattering for further exposure monitorings in the future years. So on this slide, you can see some of the like different equipments which are used for exposure monitoring. So this is basically the pump, which is sucking the air, and that air is basically then sampled for the PM 2.5. So there are, like, it says SKC air check 5000 pump, Casella Apex pump. So on this slide, you can see, so this is the gravimetric exposure cyclone. So basically, the pump sucks the air, and the air flows through this cyclone. So what the cyclone does is, like the particles which are equal to less than 2.5 microns, they would stick on the filter, which is placed in the cassette, in the cyclone, and the particles of size bigger than 2.5 will basically drop down. They will not be captured in the filter. On this third picture, you will see this RTI micro PEM. So this is basically an integrated device where the pump and the filter are basically integrated into this one device. Otherwise, the cyclone, for the traditional equipment, the cyclone was a separate piece, and pump used to be separate, which made it very bulky. But now very portable gravimetric equipments are coming, which are integrated. So both the pump and the and the filter are integrated into one device. So these are some pictures of the CO monitoring devices. So as you must have heard in the previous slides, projects where charcoal is still used in the project scenario, the methodology requires you to monitor the the CO levels over 24-hour average, and you have to comply with the WHO accepted levels there. So in case of charcoal projects, the CO monitoring would be relevant, and this slide shows some of the CO monitoring devices which are much more portable than the exposure monitoring devices. So so this is called PATS Plus, and this is an optical measurement device and also monitors CO. So this one device measures both exposure and CO, but the exposure monitoring is based on the optical approach. So before you use this PATS Plus for your exposure monitoring project scenario, you will have to establish the correlation between gravimetric monitoring and the optical monitoring, and then use this PATS Plus for subsequent exposure monitoring in the future years based on optical approach. So these are some of the continuous stove monitors. So the methodology for the usage surveys allows developers to use continuous stove monitors to basically know whether the usage rate of the project devices. So it allows both the survey approach and also the approach to use continuous stove monitors. So these are some of the some of the different types of continuous stove monitors which are used in the field. Some of them are like like very portable and easy to fix, like this Maxim I button. The others are a little more complicated, the K-sums. So depending on your project circumstances, you would basically choose between these different continuous stove monitors for your project scenario. So with this, I would just say thanks to you all for bearing with me on these slides, and passing on the baton again to Shishkin.
Thanks for stepping in, Abhishek. So the next few slides, provide some information on the household air pollution intervention tool or HAPIT. And you would have heard this term quite a few times now, in the last few minutes. So this is essentially an easy to use tool, which is used to estimate the health benefits of household energy interventions in many countries, and in some subnational geographies. The HAPIT is the second step of the quantification process, which is given under this methodology. And what it does is that it estimates the health benefits by default for the countries for which the background information is available within the HAPIT system. These health benefits are estimated based on the best available health effects evidence from the global burden of disease. The HAPIT estimates the morbidity and premature mortality reductions approximately for user created scenarios. And of course, as there is more publicly available evidence, as there are more studies done on the ground, and this information improves, the estimates of these deaths and dailies averted will also change over time. So in terms of the information required for HAPIT, these are the different inputs which are required. So you can just take a look at this, and over the next few slides I will explain how these are to be inputted in the tool itself. So this is the basic panel of the tool. So you can see sort of a web link here which is available, where one can access the latest version of this tool. So the tool uses consistent color schemes throughout its implementation to indicate areas where user inputs are required. So wherever user inputs are required, this will be highlighted in red. And areas where background information is being used, or the parameters are not required to be changed, these are highlighted in red. The home page, as you can see on your screens, includes a navigation panel on the left side of the screen. It also includes a section on the introduction, and it also has a section on the background information on the selected country, which is changeable using the drop-down menu, which you can see highlighted on the slide. So users can either scroll through the menu to identify their country of interest, or start typing the country's name in this input tab, and then select the final country of your interest. So once this country is selected, the background information pertaining to that country will automatically appear at the bottom of the screen in the two tables that you see. The first one shows the socioeconomic and demographic data for the selected country, and the other shows the annual disease data. So it gives information on years of life lost, years of life led with disability for that country, based on specific diseases which are considered by this methodology. The next tab is the input tab, and on the input tab, Averted provides the instructions and 3 input sections to fill the relevant information to estimate ADALYs. These three input sections are the population input section, which is on the top right-hand corner of your screen, the intervention input section, which is on the bottom right-hand of your screen, and the exposure-related inputs, which is on the top left-hand corner of your screen. So Averted provides default values, for most of these input parameters, which can be modified based on your project specific input values. Regarding the population inputs, the first input parameter which you need to select is the number of targeted households, and the user shall provide this information based on the targeted households for store distribution in the project scenario. The second one is the number of persons per household, and again this will be based on your survey results. And once you select the slide, you can use the slider for the total number of kids with less than 5 years old per household, and this will then automatically adjust the adults in that household. The intervention input tab again has got 2 inputs. So the first one is the percentage population using the intervention, and this is directly linked to the usage rate. And the second one is the intervention useful lifetime. And for the purpose of using this methodology, one should set the default value of this to 1 year. So this value should not be changed when applying for ADALY certification under this methodology. The final set of inputs that you see, are under the exposure related inputs. And the first input in this is the primary cook mean pre-intervention PM 2.5 exposure, which is basically the exposure of the primary cook in the baseline scenario. So one has to enter the the mean value, which is obtained after doing the monitoring and after also applying the 90-30 assessment. There is also an input field for entering the standard deviation, and this is corresponding to the the standard deviation of the baseline personal exposure monitored data, which you will be gathering from the baseline exposure measurement. Similarly, for the project scenario, there is input field to enter the mean value and also the standard deviation value. The next 2 sliders that you see here are the first one is the exposure ratio from mother to child. So as it was mentioned, the methodology primarily focus on exposures for the primary cook, and in terms of the exposure that a child will actually have as part of the methodology, there's a factor of 0.85, which is mentioned in the methodology. So so the default value of the slider is set at 0.85, and similarly for adult, non-primary cook exposures, this is set at a default value of 0.6 when compared to the primary cook. So once these values have been entered across the different tabs, it's the next step is to press the update exposures button that you see. And then after that, it normally takes about anywhere between about 1 to 5 minutes for the habit to run the analysis, and you can actually see the progress bar on this page as it is analyzing the input fields. And after the analysis, this is what will appear on the screen. So this will come in sort of the health impacts section of the panel, and the information that this is essentially providing is the the number of sort of the averted dailies and the averted deaths for child and for adult. And it can one can also select the information for for different diseases. For the purpose of using this methodology, although the tool gives a minimum averted and a maximum averted value, for the purpose of using this methodology, one should select the mean averted value. And the final step is going to the documentation tab of this tool and downloading a report. And essentially this report will include information and graphs and all the other relevant information that one would need to then undergo an audit and final submission to the gold standard. So this is a brief overview of how the habit works. And for for the next section on the Cookstove IQ, I would like to invite my colleague Richard.
Hi Shriskant. Hi, can you see my screen? Okay. Should hopefully be coming through soon. So yeah, so thanks Shriskant. Yeah, my name's Richard. So I'll just briefly introduce Cookstove IQ. So it was developed as a standardized way of collecting data from projects, calculating that data and reporting it using an online database that could be accessed anywhere. And as we've mentioned, ADALYs methodology has been fully integrated into it. And the reason for this is that although HAPIT does all of the clever calculations, there are some additional bits of data processing that need to be done for ADALYs to be certifiable from projects. So I'll just launch straight into a view of IQ set up for an ADALYs project. There's a lot of information on here, so I'll just summarize it very briefly. So on the left is a set of menus that broadly represent the stages in a project cycle. And the way that IQ works is you build up information about your project such to a point where you can estimate credibly the number of ADALYs that can be certified from your project. And essentially, if you've input all of the information up to the estimated ADALY stage, then and the gold standard has approved this information, then you have a registered project. So in order to demonstrate the integration of HAPIT and IQ, let's assume that we are looking at a registered project in its first monitoring period 1, which is calendar year 2017. So essentially, there are this table here is a mirror of all of the information that you have to input into HAPIT, and the idea is that you input into IQ first, and then using a link, you transfer that information across to HAPIT. One of the useful things that IQ does for you is it automates a lot of the calculations for you, and the chief one that I'd like to show here really is the stoves count. So within a project on IQ, you have a stoves database, which I'll just show on this screen, in which you have the details about every single stove that's within your project. So this will include dates of sale and also a set of codes that allow each individual stove to be coded to a specific scenario that exists within the project. For the purpose of this example, there's only one scenario, just to make it nice and easy. And so all of this information here, as I mentioned, is then later input into HAPIT. There's a few interesting validations that happen on here. So if you change that value here, the grayed out versions are updated automatically. So hopefully it's a very user-friendly interface in that any information that you can change is part of the monitoring. Anything else is set as part of that project. So an example of a set piece of information is the baseline personal exposure monitoring value. So in this project, it's 360. As you can see, you can't change that value, it's set. So that therefore removes any chance of human error in copying that information across. So there's a correction factor that we discussed briefly, and that can be applied on the tool that then corrects measured values from an optical device to a gravimetric device, and that allows the correction to be taken into account when producing ADALYs. So I'll just go back a screen because it's moved forward. So once you've input all on the top table, you can then extract the information from Happit and then place it in the bottom table, which should be soon displayed on screen. Never mind if it's not. So, okay. So this bottom table, this is where you input the data from Happit back into IQ. And the reason that you have to do it is because Happit only works on timescales of 1 year. So this result of 2,500 ADALYs is for 500 stoves that have been working for 1 year. So what IQ does is it then converts this information into the ADALYs earned for each individual stove in the stove database. And practically speaking, what it calculates is the number of operational days in total for all of the stoves that are crediting between the set dates. It does this by working out the number of ADALYs per household per day, which is something that Happit doesn't do, with the end result being the total number of certifiable ADALYs for that project between the dates of the monitoring period. If you recall from the example, Happit forecast 2,500, but based on the dates in the stove database, the number of operational days mean that only 503 were actually accrued during this date because the stoves weren't operating for a full year. So I think we'll hand back to Shrikant, who'll deliver the final piece of the presentation.
Thanks, Richard. So as mentioned at the beginning, this collaboration with World Bank also involved the preparation of a reference manual. So the aim of this reference manual is to provide very layman, very non-technical information on this methodology, and it will be designed in a very non-methodology manner, if you will. So it will be simple to read, and it will be full of pictures and illustrations, which would better help understand the spirit and the requirements of the methodology. It is also designed to provide information which typically is difficult to include within a methodology which is very technical in nature. So for example, we realize that it's also important to provide information on the availability of the monitoring instruments, the typical pricing of them, and actually where they can be procured, so that this can be sort of a one-stop shop for project developers who see value in applying this methodology and immediately want to implement it. This manual will also include information on the contact details of different agencies which have expertise in monitoring and testing exposures to PM 2.5. So this is one of the challenges that we've heard from from different stakeholders, that there is not enough information available on regional and local expertise in monitoring and testing PM 2.5. And over the course of the last few months, as we've been implementing this project, we've identified several agencies who have these expertise, and we'll be providing a list of such experts in this reference manual. And of course, this manual will also include best practices on how to monitor usage and exposure to PM 2.5. The reference manual will then form the basis for actually creating an online tutorial, and the objective is to help facilitate knowledge acquisition on the GSA ADALYs methodology. And again, the online tutorial has been designed in a way that it's easy to understand in a very non-technical format, and it will help practitioners understand the finer details of the methodology. So with this, we come to the end of the presentation. I would like to quickly acknowledge, the funding by the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, which is a global knowledge and technical assistance program administered by the World Bank, and it also provides analytical and advisory services to low and middle income countries to increase their know-how and institutional capacity. So with this, I think we have a couple of minutes to take quick questions. And in case you have questions, then please, use the, your panel, which has this option of, so you will see the symbol of a hand on your panel. So please, click on that. And once we see raised hands, we can quickly, unmute you for you to ask your question.
So there's a question here. What if a project does not use the online IQ database to track stoves installed, but rather keeps their own database in another format? Can Cookstove IQ still be used to calculate ADALYs? Shrikant, I'm happy to handle that one. So the short answer is no at the moment. Because Cookstove IQ is designed around the stove database. So I think in future versions we can probably build this in, but as of this moment in time, it's not currently available. So I hope that answers the question. I think we have one more minute, and so there's a question coming in here. Is the reference manual available in Spanish? Sriskant or Abhishek, I'll hand that question over to you.
Thanks, Richard. So unfortunately, at the moment, this will only be in English. But depending on the interest, in the future, we can look to translate it in other languages. So Richard, I'm also going to quickly unmute Kiran Kumar, who's raised his hand, for him to ask his question. So Kiran Kumar, we are unmuting you. Can you kindly, go ahead with your question?
Yes. Well, the thing is, but do we have any default values for PM 2.5?
Yeah. So your voice was not clear, but as you were asking that any pre-identified values for PM 2.5 exposure. So these are actually based on actual measurements that you will be doing in these pilot projects. I would next quickly unmute Mr. Nikhil Desai.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Two questions. You spoke of credible ADALYs. Who is granting you the authority that ADALYs are a credible substitute for the STD 3.9.1? There is no other health intervention where I see ADALYs being advanced as a metric. So where do you derive your authority from, or is it just by assertion? And the second question is, you claim to be a standards and certification body under which law? Swiss law or what else?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your questions. I think we actually have just run over time here, and Nikhil, I think so these are like relevant questions which will have to refer to our relevant team members, including Ajay, who designed the Happy tool to calculate ADALYs. So allow us to get back to you with feedback over email.
So, so with that, I think we have really run out of time. So, just to quickly also mention that we have, another webinar at the same time tomorrow. So please feel free to pass on the message to any of your colleagues or anyone in your network who's not been able to attend the webinar today. And I would like to thank, my colleagues, Richard and Abhishek, for co-presenting this webinar. And I would also like to thank you all for your participation, and wish you all a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.